Let's understand global scope. The global scope is actually a module scope. It exists in a file only. There is no concept of a truly global scope in Python. Means it cannot exist across all the modules in the entire application. The only exception to this are some of the built-in global objects such as print, dict, true, false, etc. So the built-in and global variables can be used anywhere inside our module. Let's understand this by an example. Let me define a global variable a, and then we are going to access it in a user defined function. So let me define a function. We print the value of global variable a. Now if you call this function, you can see that we are able to access a global variable a value in our function. If you will define a value to the variable a in your local scope, it will not affect a global a value. Let's see this by an example. Let me again define a function in which let me define the value of a and then print its value. Now if I'll call this function, we are actually accessing the local a variable. But if we try to access a global a variable, its value is still same. But if you want to override the value of global a variable in your function, what we need to do is we need to use a keyword global. Let's see how to do that. Let me again define a function in which we are going to override a global a variable's value. Now let me define it as 30. Let's return a. Now let's print the value of a before calling this function. It's 10. The global a variable's value is 10. But when you call this function, in this function you have actually override the value of a global variable. This will execute. Now if you try to access this global variable, it will return you 30 because we have override the value of this a global variable in our function. Okay. Now if you want to define a global variable in your function which was never defined before, you can do that. Let's do it in our code. Let me define a global variable. Let me define its value. Let's put it hello world. Let's return the variable where. Now if you try to print the variable where, it will give you an error because this where variable is defined in our function. It will not considered as global variable until we call this function. Once you call this function, it will access the value of this variable. Okay, there is one more thing that we need to know about global variables, and that is we cannot access global variables before defining it in our function. How? Let's see. If I am defining a function and I am trying to access a global variable, and then I'll define its value, then print or return a. Will this function work? This function will give you unbound local error. So you can see that we cannot access the global variable before defining the same variable in our function. Okay, but if you remove this statement and then execute this statement, it will not give you an error, but if you try to access it, it will give you an error. Okay, so that's it for today's video. Thank you. Have a nice day.